Climate scientists are sounding the alarm over worrying heat waves at both of Earth's poles. Temperatures in Antarctica and in the North Pole reached record levels last weekend, roughly 40 degrees Celsius above normal.
Some scientists think that the heat waves at the poles are a signal of the damage humanity is wreaking on the climate, and the melting could also trigger further cascading changes, according to some, that will accelerate climate breakdown. Writing fellow for the American Prospect, Lee Harris, joins us now. Lee, thanks for being with us.
Thanks. Glad to be on.
So talk to us about this. I just read a few articles, and it sounds to me like at least the scientists quoted in this article are not willing to say that climate change is necessarily the cause of this extreme weather. Talk to us about that.
For sure. Well, just to explain first what's going on and then get into what climate scientists are saying. This isn't the first time we've seen crazy heat caps at the poles. And in fact, the Arctic is getting hotter at several times the pace of areas closer to the equator just because of how heating works. But just to say why this is kind of a freak event, the poles are in opposite seasons. So you shouldn't see North and South poles both melting at the same time. Right now, Antarctica is just coming out of its summer months, so it should be cooling off pretty rapidly. And it is definitely a signal that weather is becoming more extreme, meaning not just hotter overall, but weirder and more unpredictable. Now, in Antarctica, scientists have been blaming potentially a giant current of warm and moist air that they're calling an atmospheric river. And it's true that, like you're saying, some scientists have kind of emphasized the freak nature of these events, saying we've never seen anything like this, and basically we need to learn more to figure out exactly what's going on. But I think the reason for that is that immediately forecasting freak weather is really hard. There's still a lot of unknowns, especially as weather patterns get more unpredictable. But the overall picture of climate heating making weather more extreme, and this isn't just heating, it's droughts and rain patterns and any number of severe climate events, that pattern is clear. It's just hard to forecast over the short term how the general trend of heating plays out.
Yeah, and the IPCC, which is the kind of the UN's climate panel, they take a look at all of the different climate science, and then they basically summarize it every 7 years or so. And so they're often kind of a little bit behind, and it's a consensus process, so they're more conservative than you might find some others to be. And in this recent one from last year, they finally said, yeah, we can't pinpoint every single event on climate change, but we can now say with confidence that we are getting more extreme events as a result of climate change. And what Michael Mann was saying in response to this particular event, I want to get your take on this, is that while he was saying that the models, going back to the 80s or so, have forecast the temperature rise, pretty accurately, despite Jordan Peterson's claim that modeling is impossible. What they have undershot is actually the number and severity of extreme weather events. So what do you take from that?
Whatever, that kind of the only thing you can expect is more uncertainty. I mean, there was an analogy from some researchers at the University of Chicago that I found really helpful in thinking about this. So a bunch of these abnormal weather patterns, not just in the Arctic, but that we're seeing more generally, have been linked to disruptions in the jet stream. And that's one of the things that they're speculating is going on in Antarctica, right, is this atmospheric river. And these UChicago researchers described it as a traffic jam in the jet stream, where currents can end up taking way more meandering paths and following more unpredictable patterns. So because of that kind of traffic jam dynamic where heating produces more meandering, it's really hard to forecast where a particular extreme event is going to occur. But what overall is that we're going to get not just more heating, but also more, like I said, droughts and flooding, and generally more weather extremes.
And it sounds like it might do more than that, but it actually might shift the tilt of the Earth. Have you heard about this? Where they say that the melting glaciers on the poles is actually shifting the poles, and they've actually been shifting since they say like 1995. An eastward shift in the actual tilt of the Earth because of the mass of the Earth moving around, which is, I think, really fascinating. So it's not just we're going to see extreme climate. We might see a real shift happening if the Earth actually begins to tilt in a different way. Have you heard of that?
That's interesting. I think I've heard of that, but the most concrete effect that that scientists are predicting just coming out of the heating that we're seeing right now in the Arctic and Antarctica is, first of all, it's just a signal of where we are in these extreme weather patterns. But beyond being a signal, one concrete effect is that sea ice cover is melting, and snow cover in the Arctic is also melting. And that creates this feedback loop where ice and snow reflect sunlight. But then when sea ice melts, the ocean is darker and it absorbs more sunlight and warms up more quickly. So it becomes this really negative feedback loop.
And there's been a push, from Republicans and from some on the left too, to say, you know what, caring about this is kind of a boutique thing for liberals who just want to celebrate their virtue by putting solar panels on their roof. But what are the consequences that we're seeing for working people of what we're already seeing? Not the future, but what we're already seeing.
Yeah, really immediate effects. I mean, you'll remember the Pacific Northwest heat wave that hit people last year in states like Oregon. That led to around 600 excess deaths, according to CDC data. So, and that's not just deaths from heat stroke and really obvious impacts of climate change, but also other conditions that are exacerbated by exposure to really high temperatures like heart disease. And that's going to affect homeless people and elderly people, especially. They die at higher rates from extreme heat. But I guess the point is, yeah, this doesn't just kill polar bears and reindeer, it also kills people. By the way, I think that the possibility that climate change ends up getting spun as this elite sort of hobby, as this lifestyle, that's a very real possibility. If the left fails to make the case for climate change as what it is, which is something that punishes working people, makes their lives harder and shorter, then it could absolutely become something that's just another form of virtue signaling, driving your Tesla and putting up your solar panels. But that would be a kind of warping of the reality that Americans and people around the world are facing, which is that it has really concrete impacts, doing things like drive up the likelihood of geopolitical conflict, and it has agricultural impacts on farmers in making crop yields lower. I mean, the other thing to say, by the way, about heating in general is that scientists often talk about 2 degrees Celsius, or that's like 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, as a hard upper limit of warming. And I think talking about the global average is useful, but it's kind of misleading because it makes it sound almost like everywhere warms predictably and steadily. But there's huge amounts of regional variation in extreme heat. It looks different in different places. That's partly because oceans cover a bunch of the world, so there are uneven patterns of warming because the seas warm more slowly than land. And there are also dynamics like what I said about the loss of snow that reflects heat in the Arctic. That just means that different parts of the world warm at different rates. Anyway, what that means is that the impacts on different regions are felt at really different rates. So in a place like Guatemala, that's gotten hotter. That country has gotten hotter by about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit since 1960. And it's not just getting hotter. Their dry season is getting longer, and there are also more frequent and unpredictable rains, which have ruined their crop yields. So what does that mean for workers? For one thing, there was a 2018 study that found that coffee production in Guatemala is going to see serious disruptions because coffee that's grown at lower elevations might not be economically viable in Guatemala by 2050. There are knock-on effects from that, like increased migration, and obviously that's hurting Guatemalan workers. Now, again, if we get this wrong and we turn climate into a culture war, then what does the issue look like? It looks like Americans not being able to afford their Starbucks or seeing some disruption in, their fancy coffee flavor that they like from that region. That could very much be the way that the culture wars spin this. But the real story to tell would be the effects of climate change on not just Central American farmers, but American farmers and other people in the commodities sector that are going to see serious commodity risk and financial risk coming out of these
Lee,
threats.
are there any, I wonder if, are there any positive knockoff effects though? I mean, you're only talking about the areas that get warmer and now are less, they're getting too hot. They're not places people want to live or grow crops, that kind of thing. Are there places that are currently too cold that benefit from like a little bit of warming? Right? If you're saying that that's like it's an average across the board, there are some places that will become more habitable, right?
So it's funny, newspaper editors love this kind of story. Like, they're always looking to be pitched a story about the new places that you can grow fancy wine. They'll be like, there's this new neighborhood in Germany or in England that can now grow red wine grapes because France's climate is changing. And Russia and Canada are going to become, the new dense urban cores of the post-climate world. But the thing to remember is that it's not just heating, it's also destabilizing and unpredictable. So the permafrost is melting, for example. That doesn't just mean that these areas are becoming, that areas in the Arctic and the near Arctic will become nice, fertile farmland. It means that the growing season of farmland in these areas is changing and becoming more unpredictable. If it were a nice, steady, predictable rise in temperatures, then maybe everyone could smoothly migrate up to Canada and Russia and areas further north and call it a day. But that's not at all how climate change proceeds. As we see, there are these freak events that we don't even see around the corner because while the general dynamic is easy to predict, the kind of week-to-week swings of what a global, a warming planet looks like are highly unpredictable.
And I think that's the real story that people should be focusing on a bit, is that migration pattern, because it's a fairly new concept to have borders and nations. I mean, of course, there have been countries that or tribes that have kind of carved out space, but the map of the world being carved into these different little countries. I agree. We absolutely have to do something about climate change and try to slow it. I don't think we could ever stop it. I think it's just the natural progression of the Earth. There's no way to stop it, but we can slow it so that we can at least better prepare for the changes that are coming. But one of those changes I do think is a bigger, broader discussion on immigration, migration patterns, and what we do to allow people to move. I believe it's a human right to be able to move from one place to another, especially when you're facing things like drastic climate changes.
Yeah.
But that's what I think that the conversation
I think that's well said. It's a real question of human rights that we're going to have to grapple with in the future. And the countries that accept more are actually going to do better. But Lee, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me on.
And we will have more Rising right after this.